Thanks, Mungiwe. Now, despite energy and many other challenges, is South Africa still able to promote itself as an attractive investment destination and trade partner? South Africa will host its 5th South African Investment Conference in Johannesburg in just under 2 weeks. And this is the culmination of an investment drive aimed at attracting 1.2 trillion rand over 5 years. Now, I can tell you that from a government website, it shows that we're almost there. So last year, 270 billion or so was raised. That takes the total to 1.14 trillion, which is 95% of the target. Today, the Reserve Bank governor announced higher interest rates, but he also said that private sector investment is expected to remain positive, largely due to efforts to resolve the tight security supply. So are those efforts yielding results? Well, to discuss tonight, we're joined by our panel. As you can see, we have Stavros Nicolaou, member of the BRICS Business Council, Crystal Huntley, a Nedbank economist, Kganki Matabane, who is the CEO of the Black Business Council, and Owen and Nkomo, director of Inkunzi Wealth Group. Let me start with you, Ms. Huntley. What do you think is the state of investment in South Africa? So it sounds like we will meet the investment drive targets. A skeptic could say, well, we would have had some investment anyway. These announcements are just being brought under the banner of South Africa's investment drive. Government takes the credit. What do you think about where we are?
So it's interesting that, so I think what we need to see is we are seeing government stepping up their efforts to try and facilitate private investment into the country. I mean, if you take a look at what's been happening with, for example, some of the plans that are put in place, particularly with respect to energy, for instance, we're seeing that they've put in place this entire energy action plan. And what we've seen, if you're considering the private sector project plans that were announced in 2022, out of the total announced project plans, 78% of that does come from the private sector, and these plans are specifically in line with the REP, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, and of course other green energy projects. So I think that steps to facilitate private sector investment into the economy are underway, and with the example that I just made of the private sector accounting for a big proportion of investment, particularly into REP, I think that we're getting there, or trying to get there.
All right. Well, let me ask you, Stavros Nicolaou. The investment summit is about local and international investment. So we're speaking to you from the BRICS Business Council, but of course you're also involved in Aspen, which has invested in this country. Does it make a difference that an electricity minister has been announced, that the energy plan has been outlined? What's the sense right now of optimism or pessimism?
Francis, firstly, thanks very much for having me on the show and discussing a very important topic that cuts across the lives of every single South African. My preface in comment would be that one should never talk down your own prospects in life, right? I think if you talk down your own prospects, you've got virtually a zero chance of succeeding. So I think what we do need, first of all, is a more balanced narrative about our country. Yes, our country is facing challenges, energy security being the most prominent of those. However, we should look at what are the structural reforms that are presently taking place. What are those sectors that are competitive in our economy that can pull us through at these or during these difficult times? And I think that's a different way of looking at it, and not for one moment minimizing the challenges that we face. Now, energy is the single biggest challenge at the moment. I'm of the view that it was a good thing, despite many detractors, that the president appointed an electricity minister, because for me it demonstrates the focus that is being placed on what is arguably the single biggest hindrance to investment in our country at this point in time. If you have someone that is focused on that, and that is his only mandate, that's what he's got to execute against, coupled with some of the structural reforms that Crystal mentioned earlier, i.e., that we are opening up for other energy sources, such as solar, such as wind, by way of example, and also that we are starting to see reform and greater private and public collaboration in other areas of infrastructure, such as ports and harbour. Those are very positive developments. So I think overall, good that we've got an electricity minister because it gives us the requisite focus, and also very encouraged by some of the structural reforms that are taking place. But as a final comment, all of this can only happen if we have appropriate pace and execution in timing are very, very critical here. We've got to act with urgency.
Mr. Matabane, do you agree? And what's crucial here, from your perspective, is has black business benefited from the investment drive? And of course, there are all these new opportunities. Look at solar, and the fact that we have an expected outpacing of people putting up solar panels compared to the skills that are actually there. Is this an opportunity for black small business and big business to get on board?
Thank you, Francis, for inviting us, and good afternoon, good evening to you and the viewers. I think the challenge that we have in South Africa most of the time is that we don't start with the problem statement. When you look at the investment summits that we've been having over the years, we don't necessarily then sit and say, what is it that we want to achieve? Outside the public relations of saying we've attracted so much and so much. So we need to have that problem statement to say, do we want to use the investments to grow the economy? Do you want to use the investments to support small business as per the National Development Plan? Do you want to use the investment to support black business, small business, women-owned businesses? And we then need to, on a yearly basis, we need to then look back and say, when did we start with these investment conferences? What have we achieved so far from the investment conferences? It's one thing to announce that I'm going to make an investment, but it's something else to actually say, I've made this investment, it has resulted in 1, 2, 3. So from black business point of view and small business point of view, we don't see the fruits of these investments, to be honest with you. Again, the ownership of the economy still remains the same. The management of the economy still remains the same. The small businesses are closing down on a daily basis because of lack of access to funding. So we're not seeing the results of all these big announcements that have been made all the years. So maybe this year, I think the advice may be, maybe the president must go and say, since my first announcement, my first investment summit, this is what I've achieved. These are the number of jobs that came out of this, because it must mean something to even a resident or someone who stays in an informal settlement, someone who stays in a rural area. It must make sense. But at the moment, it doesn't make sense.
All right. So you want some more tangible details. Owen and Nkomo, let me come to you. So there are different types of investment. The fixed investment, I think we've been mainly talking about, is when companies come and actually build factories or create those jobs. But then there's also liquidity flows in and out of the markets. That's what you look. You can talk about the rand today. But while we've had this investment drive, what's been happening there? We hear of outflows from the JSE. What's the impact of grey listing, for example, more recently, but there are always inflows as well. What are you seeing over time?
Yes, thanks for having me, Francis, and good evening to the viewers and my fellow panelists. I think it's been very obvious that the foreign investors over the past few years have been withdrawing money from South Africa. You see that in the bond market, you're seeing it in the equities markets. Hundreds of billions of rands have been pulled out of South Africa by foreign investors, particularly because of this challenge that we have with Eskom. And if you talk about the other scenario that was spoken about earlier on the shows, you were talking about these municipal problems that we have in Gauteng, where it's much easier to do many things in Gauteng than to be a mayor of one of the big metros here in Gauteng. So those things mean that the implementation of some of the growth projects that the government is trying to drive, when you're a foreign investor and you look at these challenges that are happening in local government, you're looking at it all the way to the top of government. There's quite a lot of things that are red flags that have sort of deterred people from coming into the country to invest. But there is some guys that have said, you know what, we will still come in and make investments, direct investments, particularly in the motor vehicle space. We've seen lots of guys coming through to invest in the country. Ford, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and a few other investors have come through to say, okay, we'll take a chance with South Africa. But I do think that we are our biggest enemy. And like Mr. Matabane was just saying right now, I think that next year, maybe what we should do with the investment summit, just to sit back and say, okay, guys, we started this thing a few years ago. Let us take stock. And importantly, let us see why people who say they're going to invest money are not investing. And if you look at the fact that the economy is going to slow down by a margin of 0.2% this year, given that we've got this ESCOM problems, I would say that if we had managed to get 78% of this committed investment to start working in the country, if these projects had been shovel ready and people were working, we would have a different picture of the GDP. So numbers don't lie. All these efforts, in my view, at this stage, they still need a little bit more management and implementation than conversations.
Yeah. Ms. Huntley, do you agree there's a lot of fixing to be done? In short, I was looking at what a government has outlined as the 10 sort of attractive phenomena around South Africa. One of them was, listen to this, invest in South Africa. We've got world-class infrastructure and logistics. But I think the experts are starting to differ on that. So really, the hard work has to be clear to local investors and the rest of the world.
Definitely. I totally agree, especially with what Nkomo was saying. And he raised a question on like what needs to be happen and why aren't we seeing these investments come through? And on that point, I'd just like to take a step back in terms of creating this enabling environment that the government needs to do in order to make investors just stating that infrastructure is brilliant is not enough to make investors want to invest, and they need to take a step back and create an enabling environment. And maybe if I could just throw a spanner in the works and state some things that's on the mind of a lot of people, and that's state failures that we have experienced, and maybe starting by acknowledging that there's been state capture, there's been widespread corruption, there's been failing SOEs, mass service delivery failures like we were speaking about earlier, and poor policy choices that basically got us to where we are now. And that's why we are in this desperate need for investment. And I think what the government needs to do is to step back and address and go back to basics and address basic issues such as strengthening law enforcement, eradicating corruption, through all through procurement at all levels of government. We need to fix our municipalities. We need to fix capital expenditure delivery, by ensuring that every infrastructure project, no matter how small it is, delivers a good quality asset. And then we need to protect that infrastructure, from criminal syndicates and vandalism. So essentially, we need to take a step back before we're speaking about these great opportunities for investment, or in terms of trying to attract investment and to actually create this enabling environment.
All right, thank you very much. And in terms of crime, I think we have to be honest about companies from overseas coming and thinking, well, what happens if one of our execs or one of our workers are involved in a crime incident? Stavros, another spanner in the works, perhaps, is South Africa's perceived closeness to Russia right now, and that's been in the news. You're part of the BRICS Business Council, and we don't get into all the ethics, but from a business perspective, do you think that a pro or a con right now? I mean, we were talking about de-dollarization yesterday, the BRICS possibly becoming this group that's very attractive and many people want to join. However, we are possibly affecting relationships with other trading partners. How do you perceive that right now, the pros versus the cons?
Francis, firstly, before I answer your question directly, it would be remiss of me not to make a very brief comment on the criminality and
Sure.
all the syndicates that are operating in our country, because this is all interlinked. And the only way I believe we're going to get on top of all of these issues, because capacity and capability has been hollowed out in many, many parts of government. Only if we get the private and the public sector working together, I believe, will we get the country back onto an appropriate economic trajectory. And that incidentally includes security as well. We have security firms that I think, if appropriately garnered and directed, can work closely with government to put a significant dent in the criminality that is currently taking place. Now, let me answer your question more directly on Russia. South African business has a view that we need to trade where we are going to maximize value and opportunity for the country, both for the country as a whole, but also for companies and individual sectors. So we can never discount the Western trade patterns, and neither can we discount the Eastern trade patterns. So I think what we do need to see, though, is a much closer alignment between our foreign policy and our economic policy in the country. Those are not always aligned, and we do need a closer alignment of the two. And I don't think it's a case of picking sides here. For example, we as business have been very alive and sensitive to the humanitarian crisis that is playing out in the Ukraine. So much so that my company Aspen made significant donations of medicines and other equipment to the Ukrainian people. So South African business is not insensitive to the humanitarian plight of what is going on in Ukraine. But what we are in favor of is very much a negotiated settlement, and that is a negotiated settlement in the Ukraine. And that is what we speak to our government every time we have the opportunity, is say, South Africa, play your role. You know, we punch way above our weight in international affairs. We're the only African country in the G20. We're the only African country in the BRICS formation. We're highly influential in the African Union. These are all influential institutions. So every time we speak to our government, we say, please use your influence to try and get a negotiated settlement. No war anywhere in the world is good for business, and it's not good for our country. And Kganki will bear me out that we need to keep sending that message to our government. Use your influence to try and get a negotiated settlement. And I believe that is what they are trying to do.
Kganki, do you agree? I know Black Business, the council has been represented or part of BRICS Business Council fora.
Yes, Francis. I think we are aligned with what Stavros is saying, because we do have, like, out of the 5 council members, 2 members were nominated by Black Business Council. So we are aligned then. But I think let's go back to some of the environmental issues or conducive environmental issues that we need to sort out. I think for us, the same energy that is being put by government in trying to resolve the power issues should also go into resolving crime. I think there are a lot of people who are immigrating, and those are taxpayers, high worth net individuals, and then they are living a hole, because then as they leave, most of them are able to start companies. They are paying taxes. As they leave, then they are leaving a hole where someone else needs to come in and pick it up. So it's important that we deal with the crime. We cannot have a situation where we've got illegal mining, we've got the construction mafias, people who just come to a company and say, I want 30%. And then the challenge is that if we don't deal with that issue, it perpetuates, then people become more emboldened. And we've seen it started in KZN, then went to Limpopo, now it's in Northwest, now it's all over the country. So the same energy that we use, we need to do that. And also, lastly, let's also use the same energy to develop the infrastructure. Make sure that the roads are that we have in municipalities are proper, because the companies want to invest in municipalities, but they can't because of what is happening there.
All right, we've basically run out of time, but Owen and Nkomo, I can give you the last word. What do you want to hear? Maybe you'd actually want to see something from government as we head towards the 5th Investment Summit and even towards elections next year.
I think I'd like to see more of consequences for those ministers, for those departments that sit on budgets and don't utilize those budgets. I'd like to see the government working proactively with the private sector and the unions and all key stakeholders to encourage corporate South Africa and the government to come to the table and start taking money out of their pockets and putting it into projects. And we need to fight corruption. If we don't fight corruption, there's no way that we're going to be able to attract foreign investors. And we need to address the issue of infrastructure. If you look at Transnet needs to be sorted out so we can export all these things that we're taking out of the ground. We've lost probably more than $500 million over the past several years just because of capacity shortages at our port terminals. And I think those are the most important things, in my view, to address, and making sure that there is capital for business to actually meet all these demands that the country requires for the engines of growth to start running, so we can see our GDP going back to 3% plus.
All right, I'd like to thank all of you. I think that was a really factual, sobering look at the state of investment in South Africa. Stavros Nicolaou, member of the BRICS Business Council, Crystal Huntley, a Nedbank economist, Kganki Matabane, the CEO of the Black Business Council, Owen and Nkomo, the director of Inkunzi Wealth Group. Thank you to you all tonight.